Buddy Greg slid a cold bottle across the bar and said, "You look like a man who just won something he didn't know he was fighting for." And honestly, that was exactly right. My name is Pierce. I spent 23 years as a licensed structural engineer, 12 of them as the senior project engineer at Halcyon Infrastructure Group, a mid-sized firm out of Columbus, Ohio, that had built its reputation on state and federal contract work. Bridges, highway overpasses, flood control structures. The kind of projects where if something goes wrong, people die. That's not dramatic, that's just the job. I wasn't flashy about what I did, never needed to be. In this industry, your reputation is built in rooms where politicians and bureaucrats sit across from engineers, and they need to trust that the person across from them knows what every bolt, every load calculation, every soil report actually means. I was that person for Halcyon for over a decade. The Ohio Department of Transportation knew my name. The Army Corps of Engineers had worked with me on 2 flood mitigation projects along the Scioto River. My PE stamp, my professional engineer license, was on more than 60 completed structures across 4 states. I tell you this, not to brag. I tell you this because it matters for what came next. About 3 years ago, Halcyon landed the biggest contract in the firm's history. A $78 million highway interchange redesign outside of Dayton, a federal and state co-funded project that had been in the pipeline for years. I had been the lead engineer on the proposal. I had spent 4 months working with the federal project officer, a methodical woman named Sandra from the FHWA regional office, building the technical scope. When we won, I was in the conference room when the managing partner, a 68-year-old man named Frank, who had built Halcyon from nothing, shook my hand and said, "This one's yours, Pierce. You brought it home." That was in October. By the following January, everything had changed. Not the project, not the contract, me. Frank had retired in November, faster than any of us expected. The transition had been in the works for a while, apparently, but the timeline accelerated when his doctor told him his heart wasn't going to wait on a graceful exit strategy. He handed the keys to his son-in-law, a 37-year-old named Cody, who had spent the previous 5 years running a property management company in Scottsdale. Cody had an MBA from Arizona State and strong opinions about operational efficiency and virtually no understanding of what it meant to be a licensed professional engineering firm operating under federal regulatory frameworks. I didn't dislike Cody immediately. I tried to be fair. I walked him through the Dayton project in our first meeting. I explained the FHWA compliance requirements, the submittal schedule, the PE stamp process. He nodded a lot. He used words like bandwidth and deliverables and stakeholder alignment. He asked me why we didn't just use a cheaper subcontractor for the geotechnical analysis. I explained that our contract required licensed in-house oversight for all primary technical work. He said he'd circle back on that. He didn't circle back. He just started making decisions. By February, he had reorganized the firm's structure. 3 senior engineers who had been with Halcyon for over 8 years were let go as part of what he called a strategic realignment. I watched it happen and told myself it wasn't my business. I had a project to run. I focused on that. My vesting date was April 15th. I had been on an equity participation plan since my 7th year with the company. A deferred compensation arrangement tied the tenure and project performance. On April 15th, a tranche of company equity equivalent to $115,000 would fully vest and become mine. Frank had structured the plan specifically to reward long-term contributors. It was in writing, signed, part of my employment agreement. I wasn't thinking about it constantly, but I was aware of it the way you're aware of a mortgage payment that's almost paid off. It's just there in the background, solid and real. The week before Easter, Cody called me into his office. He had redecorated since Frank left. The old fishing photos were gone. There was a standing desk now and one of those abstract canvas prints that looked like someone sneezed blue paint at a white wall and charged $400 for the frame. He was standing when I came in. That was the first thing I noticed. People stand when they want the other person to feel like they're being received, not invited. "Pierce," he said, "I'm going to be straight with you. I've learned over the years that when someone says that, they've already decided something, and what follows is a presentation, not a conversation." He told me the firm was restructuring its technical leadership model. He said they were moving toward a distributed project ownership approach that would rely more heavily on external consultants and less on senior internal staff with legacy compensation structures. He said my position was being eliminated, effective immediately. I looked at him for a moment. I kept my voice level. It's something I learned early in my career. Engineers don't get to have feelings in rooms full of suits. You learn to process on your own time. Effective immediately, I repeated. We'll honor your standard severance, he said. 2 weeks per year of service. HR will have the paperwork ready by end of day. 23 weeks of severance for 12 years of work that had built the most significant contract this firm had ever secured. I thought about April 15th, which was 11 days away. I didn't say anything about that. I thanked him for his time, which is a thing I've always done in uncomfortable professional moments. Not because I'm a pushover, but because the moment you lose your composure is the moment the other person gets to write the narrative about what kind of person you are. I walked back to my office, closed the door, and sat down. Then I called my attorney. Her name is Vivienne, and she had drafted my original employment agreement when I joined Halcyon 12 years ago. She knew that contract better than I did. Did they say anything about the equity? She asked. No, I said. Don't sign anything, she said. Not yet. I didn't. What Cody didn't know, what I suspect he never read carefully enough to find out, was a clause in my employment agreement that Vivienne had insisted on when I joined. The clause stated that in the event of termination without cause, any unvested equity tranches scheduled to vest within 90 days of the termination date would immediately accelerate and vest in full. 11 days was well within 90 days. There was a second thing Cody didn't know, and this one was bigger. In Ohio, as in most states, any engineering plan submitted for public infrastructure projects must bear the wet signature and seal of the licensed professional engineer of record. You can't just hand that off. You can't reassign it. The PE of record has legal responsibility for those plans, and that responsibility lives with the license, which belongs to the individual, not the firm. My license, my stamp, my legal name on every primary submittal document for the Dayton project. I was the engineer of record on $78 million worth of active federal contract work. When I left Halcyon, I didn't take anything that wasn't mine. I packed my personal items, shook hands with the 2 colleagues who came to say goodbye quietly in the hallway, and drove home. I called Greg on the way and told him I'd been let go. He said, "Meet me at Flanagan's at 6. And I did. That night, I told him the whole thing. He listened without interrupting, which is one of the reasons I've kept him as a friend for 30 years. When I finished, he said, "So, what happens to the bridge project?" "Nothing can happen to it," I said. "That's kind of the point." He thought about that for a second. "They don't know yet. They'll figure it out Monday morning," I said. He slid his beer to the side and looked at me. "And you're just going to wait?" "I'm going to let the law do what it does," I said. "I've got a call with Vivienne tomorrow morning." I didn't have to wait until Monday. Cody called my cell phone Saturday afternoon. I was in the backyard, pulling up dead tomato plants from the fall that I'd never gotten around to clearing. My daughter Lily was on the porch steps watching me, 12 years old, and very serious about things, and she looked up from her book when my phone buzzed. "Dad," she said, "it's a Columbus number." I looked at the screen. It was the main office line. On a Saturday, I answered. "Pierce." Cody's voice was tight, not angry yet, but close. "I need you to come in Monday. We've got a situation with the Dayton submittal schedule. I'm not an employee of Halcyon anymore," I said. "You terminated my position Thursday." Silence. "Then, I understand that, but we need your PE stamp on the next phase submittals. FHWA is expecting the documents by the 15th. Sandra's already been in contact." I watched a sparrow land on the fence post at the edge of the yard. Lily had gone back to her book. "Cody," I said, "I can't stamp documents as a Halcyon employee because I'm not one, and my license doesn't transfer with my termination. It stays with me." More silence. Longer this time. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying you need a new engineer of record, which means you need someone with the appropriate licensure, experience on this specific project type, and FHWA approval to step into the role mid-project. That process typically takes 8 to 12 weeks, depending on the contracting agency. The Dayton submittal was due in 11 days. "Pierce." His voice had changed. The tightness was gone, and something else had come in. Something that sounded a lot like a man realizing he had made a very expensive mistake. "Let's talk about this. There's got to be a way to work this out." "There is," I said. "Have Vivienne talk to your legal team about the equity acceleration clause first. Once that's resolved, I'm happy to discuss consulting arrangements at an appropriate market rate." I hung up because I didn't have anything else to say. Vivienne called me Sunday evening. Halcyon's attorney had reviewed the employment agreement. The equity clause was airtight. The $115,000 would be paid. She said the attorney on the other end had gone quiet for a long moment before saying, "We'll need a day to advise our client." Monday morning, Cody's assistant called the schedule call. Vivienne handled it. By Tuesday afternoon, a written agreement was on its way. Full equity disbursement, the severance package as originally offered, and a formal consulting proposal request. They needed me to step in as an independent engineering consultant on the Dayton project. My rate, which Vivienne and I had discussed over coffee Sunday morning, and which I had not pulled out of thin air, was $340 an hour, with a project minimum engagement of 3 months. That was not a punitive number. That was market rate for an independent PE with federal infrastructure credentials and active project continuity. It was also, over the course of the engagement, going to amount to considerably more than the salary I had been drawing as a full-time employee. I said yes. The reason I said yes was not money. I want to be clear about that. The reason I said yes was the project. Those interchange plans represented 2 years of my technical work. There were families who would drive across that structure for the next 75 years. I cared about the plans being right. I cared about the submittal schedule being met, and Sandra at FHWA not having to deal with a mid-project engineer of record transition that would cost the agency months of review time and potentially delay federal funding disbursement. That mattered to me. The money was a consequence of the fact that my knowledge and my license had value, and that value doesn't disappear because someone signs a termination letter. What happened to Cody afterward was not my business, and I didn't follow it closely. I heard from a former colleague that the managing partner arrangement lasted less than a year before Frank's family asked him to step back into an advisory role while they restructured leadership again. I heard that 2 of the 3 engineers who had been let go before me were quietly rehired. I didn't verify any of that. By the time those conversations were happening, I had other things to think about. I had started my own firm. Small, just me and 2 colleagues I trusted, one of whom I'd worked with for 9 years at Halcyon. We focused on federal and state infrastructure consulting. We had no interest in trying to compete on volume. We were interested in doing technically excellent work on complex projects for clients who understood what they were paying for. Within 14 months of leaving Halcyon, we had signed 3 separate consulting agreements with state dots in Ohio and Kentucky. We had a working relationship with the same FHWA regional office I dealt with for years. Sandra had given my name to 2 other project officers who needed experienced PE oversight on active contracts. I'm not telling you this to describe a triumphant comeback, because that's not how I think about it. I'm telling you because I think there's something important in how it unfolded. I didn't fight Cody. I didn't make a scene in his office. I didn't call anyone to complain. I read my contract, I understood what I had built, and I trusted that the work I had done over 23 years had a kind of gravity that a termination letter couldn't cancel. There's a thing they teach you in engineering school that sounds like math and is actually philosophy. They call it load path analysis. The idea is that forces in a structure always find a path. You design for it deliberately, or the structure finds its own path and you may not like where it leads. The same principle applies to organizations. The load, the actual weight of competence, of institutional knowledge, of legally required expertise, is always there. You either account for it, or it finds its way through the system on its own terms. Cody didn't account for it. My daughter Lily asked me a few months after all of this, when I was setting up the new firm's office in a space we'd rented in Grandview Heights, what had happened. She's the kind of kid who waits until she's sure she wants to know the answer before she asks the question. She was sitting on the windowsill, watching me sort through file boxes. "Did you know it was going to work out?" she said. I thought about that honestly. I knew what I'd built, I said. I didn't know exactly how it was going to work out, but I knew that what I had wasn't something that could just be handed back or taken away. I knew that. She nodded slowly, the way she does when she's filing something away for later. "That's good," she said. "That's enough to go on." And you know what? She was right. It turned out to be exactly enough. I think about the sparrow that landed on the fence post while Cody was still talking on the phone. That detail has stuck with me longer than the dollar amounts, longer than the legal language, longer than anything Vivienne said in our calls that weekend. There was something about that bird, just going about its business while a man on the other end of the line was beginning to understand the size of what he'd done, that felt like the whole story in a single image. What happened to me wasn't luck. I want to be honest about that because it would be easy to frame it that way, as if I stumbled into a good outcome, as if the contract clause and the PE stamp rules and the FHWA timeline just happened to line up in my favor. They didn't just happen. I spent 23 years doing work I cared about deeply enough to do it right. I read my employment agreement when I signed it. I asked Vivienne to put language in it that protected what I'd built. None of that was accidental. Consequences follow choices, not luck. And most of the choices that mattered in this story were made years before Cody walked into Frank's office. What I've come to understand is that there are three things that determine how a person comes through moments like this one. The first is whether you've been straight. Not perfect. I've made plenty of technical errors in my career, called a soil report wrong, underestimated a load path, gone back and corrected it. But straight, honest with clients, honest with colleagues, honest about what you know and what you don't. When I walked out of Halcyon that Thursday, I had nothing to cover up. I had no favors owed, no corners cut. That matters more than people realize, because when the pressure comes, and it always comes, an honest record is the only foundation that holds. The second thing is whether you've stayed sharp. Cody's mistake wasn't cruelty, though he wasn't especially kind. His mistake was ignorance. Not knowing what a PE stamp meant, not knowing what the FHWA required, not reading the contract he was operating under. Ignorance is expensive in this industry. It's expensive in most industries. I spent my career learning not just how to do the work, but why the rules exist, who they protect, what happens when they're ignored. That knowledge wasn't just professional. It turned out to be the thing that made it impossible for a termination letter to take everything I'd built. The third thing, and this one is harder to teach, is whether you can hold steady when the ground shifts. The morning after I was let go, I was 54 years old, 12 years of equity on the line, a daughter watching me from the porch. I could have panicked. I could have called Cody back and begged, or signed whatever HR put in front of me just to make the uncertainty stop. I didn't, because I had learned through years of standing in rooms where structural decisions meant life or death, that the worst thing you can do under pressure is act before you understand the load. Lily asked me if I knew it was going to work out. I told her I knew what I'd built. That's the only answer I had. It's the only one that was true. And when I look back at all of it now, the termination, the phone call in the backyard, the consulting agreement, the new firm in Grandview Heights, I think that answer was also the whole lesson. You don't get to know how things will work out. You only get to know what you've built and whether it was worth building honestly. It was. It still is.